Our featured guest today is definitely the most significant player in terms of shareholder proposal activism in the 2015 proxy season. He's the comptroller of New York City, Scott Stringer, a New York native from Washington Heights, who went to local public schools and went to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, lives here on Manhattan's Upper West Side. And what he's done this year is to launch the Boardroom Accountability Project, what he calls the Boardroom Accountability Project, which has principally in this year targeted firms with, as I explained earlier, proxy access proposals, which would allow long-term shareholders that have held stock for 3 years, owning at least 3% of the corporation, to nominate a certain percentage of directors that they would prefer to see on the ballot to get on the company's own proxy ballot. We discussed that a little bit in the earlier exchange, and he can explain that a little more. You can ask questions later. We want to leave time for audience questions. I appreciate Comptroller Stringer joining us. We have a long tradition here with our Proxy Monitor programs of bringing people in who we may not agree with in some areas or may not fully agree with. Last year you saw Pat McGurn from Institutional Shareholder Services. We had some sparring there. A few years ago, the AFL-CIO's Brandon Rees compared me to Joseph Goebbels. So we brought in people that are quite hostile. I don't expect us to get that hostile, even if I think a certain news article this morning has probably mischaracterized my position to some degree in saying that I praised the broad proxy access campaign that the comptroller's done. I don't think I've really praised it. I don't think I've sharply critiqued it either. I do think it's extremely significant for shareholders, and I want us to be able to get to the bottom of some of these issues and what's motivated the campaign, and hear some of the philosophies from one of New York City's most significant public servants. So Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you. James, I just want to say that, growing up and getting my start on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the notion that I could someday come to the Manhattan Institute voluntarily is something that I think the Wall Street Journal this morning and others will say is significant, because clearly we can now have world peace.
The reporter asked me, so why did you invite Scott Stringer? And I said, well, who's obviously a progressive. I said, well, we're in New York City. If we don't invite progressives and talk to progressives, we got no one to talk to. So I thank you for joining us on that. I think it's going to be a collegial and informative exchange. So just at a broad level, what do you hope to accomplish through the Boardroom Accountability Project that you've launched, and why have you focused on singled out proxy access as the key variable that you're focusing on?
So the New York City retirement system is now $160-some billion. It's the fourth largest public pension fund, the fourth largest in the United States. It's the 12th largest in the world. And my first and foremost responsibility is really to protect the retirement security of 700,000 people who really trust the retirement system with how they're going to live as they get older. It's a real awesome responsibility, and it's something I think about a lot. And through the lens of being a long-term investor of other people's money, we wanted to make sure that the boards of the companies we invest in are doing the right thing. We want to make sure that they're watching every dollar, that they are looking at issues that we're concerned about, where we think there's vulnerability in our investment or our investment strategy. And rather than do this in piecemeal, we decided to collaborate with other large pension funds around the country. We issued 75 proxy access resolutions, which I think is a world record. It caught people's attention across the country. And all we're asking is for the natural, transparent process of running a director on a board, that there's ample opportunity to do that. Nothing more, nothing less.
Well, what is your vision then for the role of director, and how the director is supposed to be responsive to shareholders? If you're thinking about the type of director you want to serve on a public company, how do you think about that, and what's their role?
Look, we want directors to obviously be there for the right reason, but rather than speak to the individual qualification of a director, why don't we just look at what I think a board should look like? We certainly want boards that have independence. right? After Enron and WorldCom, we certainly know that runaway boards can damage share owners or portfolios like ours. So we want to have some independence. We also want diversity. And we don't just throw out the word diversity for diversity's sake, because studies show that when you have boards that are not sort of subjected to groupthink, right? The board is, you know, white, male, lives in Connecticut, same country club, you know, same friends who go to the same country club, went to the same schools. I don't begrudge that, right? But it's groupthink on their part. So when you have other people on the board, you have counterbalance, you have people who come to the board with different life experience. So obviously, that's something that we're concerned about, and we've looked into it. A lot of our boards, and I hate to say it, you know, are very male, very pale, and somewhat stale. And we have to make sure that we have the ability for more women, for more people of color with great expertise and qualification who have the ability to get on a board. Now, it's hard to get on a board if you're not part of the old boy network, right? How do you get on a board? One way you could, if the need is there, is through running as a director to serve on a board.
There are a lot of empirical studies in this space, and I argue in my report that the majority of these actually cut in the other direction on board diversity. Not that diversity is per se a bad thing, but that where there is government pressure or a mandate pushing for board diversity, that it's associated in various studies, including countries around the world that have various board quotas for females, which is the screening mechanism you pick up on this year, that it's associated with negative firm value. Have you analyzed those? What's your impression? Because you're citing certain studies, but there are other ones that cut in the other direction.
Look, I mean, there's no question that, you know, when you look at a study, sometimes you want to see what you want to see. But I think it's very clear that as it relates to boardroom accountability, a good place to start is boardroom diversity. Because again, this is about making sure that share owners like myself have a sense that the board has counterbalance and give and take on the board. If it's the same insiders on the board, we do have empirical life experience that shows that part of what I think happened with the financial meltdown is you had these very insular boards who were more concerned about excess CEO pay, more concerned about their own particular agenda than working to make sure they were creating value in the company. And for me, boards are critical in my role because we ask people, money managers, they take money and they invest in companies. So the boards are the people I rely on to make sure that the company is growing in value. You know, we're not in and out investors. We're here for the long-term, long value. If I don't like what's going on in a board or I'm worried about a company, I just can't pick up our shares and walk away. It just doesn't work that way. So I have to make sure that there's a mechanism in place for board accountability because that's the only way I can preserve value as a fiduciary of this pension fund.
Well, I think if there's one takeaway, something that Scott Stringer and Jim Copeland agree on today, we both agree that boards have value. So however we get there, we definitely agree on that point. I want to press you a little bit about the board diversity point and also the climate change point. But as I explained to the earlier panel, the New York City pension funds use 3 screening criteria. One, executive pay, which I don't particularly challenge. I think that it's a reasonable proxy. The others being climate change and board diversity. You're in the shareholder proposal process and putting some confidence in getting majority votes here, and you have done a remarkable job in getting a lot of majority support for most of your shareholder proposals. You know, not enormous majority support, but more than 50% on the vast majority of your proposals. But we also track all these shareholder proposals, and looking at the Fortune 250 companies by revenues over the past decade, there have been 394 shareholder proposals involving environmental issues, including climate change. Exactly 0 of those have gotten majority shareholder support. There have been 80 proposals on employment rights, including diversity, and only 1 of those has gotten majority support. So in light of that, I mean, if shareholders are speaking on those issues too, why do you discount shareholders' viewpoint in that context?
Well, you know, looking at this electorally for a second, one of the reasons why someone like yourself praised our boardroom accountability project was because of its success, right? I mean,
Well, I want to clarify that. What I
understand.
in terms of praising it, I am saying, yes, you were very successful in getting majority support. So I am
And that's why-
acknowledging that as a success. That's not the same as saying that I agree with the substance of everything you're
I
doing.
understand that, but keep in mind, we have our own video camera here, and you're going to be in the commercial in the next round of, we have this clip, right? So it's going to be, you're going to be famous. But let's talk about electorate. So our average victory with proxy access this year was 56%, but in many companies, we got to 60, 66%. So even with that success, we still have to make sure that the companies align with what the shareholders are asking for. So we still have a lot of work to do. On issues where we get less votes on boards, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a defeat. Think about it. If 25 or 30% of your share owners are concerned about an energy company that they don't think is making a sound investment or discussion in clean energy or tackling climate change, and then you look at the company's valuation and it's going down, if 30% of your share owners are registering a concern, I don't view it as victory or defeat. I view it as concern. And again, the reason we share owners, I'm going to use the word share owner a lot, the reason we're concerned about where the board is at is because that's our mechanism. And we've always had the right as owners of shares to run directors. But the reality is the electoral process, it would make Boss Tweed proud, right? They send out one ballot with a slate of directors, and there's no way, in any way, that you could run a slate of directors. So all we're asking for, in the rare occasion, 3% ownership in 3 years, we're not disruptors. But on the rare occasion that we want to step up and say, hey, we really have a problem with this board, could we run a slate of experts? A woman who has a very important view of climate change, or a person of color who perhaps has had real experience in the diversity field and now can lend value to that board discussion. I think that's a real opportunity for corporations in this country, and it, as the CFA says, it will enhance, proxy access will enhance the valuation, the market capitalization of a company by 1.1% or up to $140 billion in the United States.
Well, let's dig down on that a little bit, because in my study, I do a share price reaction analysis on the actual votes on these proposals. There has been another study that said on the day you announce, there's a positive 50 basis point or so stock price reaction. But what I found is around the time of the actual votes of the share price, you see the companies that are getting majority support for the proposal, in other words, supporting what you or other proponents have supported, actually underperforming significantly the market price, and then conversely, the market reaction, and then conversely, when it's failing to get 50%, there's an uptick relative to the market. So, how would you react to that? And more broadly than just the details of what I found, if in fact there were significant studies that were to come out there and to show that the market's actually reacting negatively to information about these studies, in other words, they cut the other way as a CFA Institute, would that change the way you think about this?
Again, we look at the CFA, which is made up of professionals that I think have great respect in this industry, but I think at the end of the day, what we're looking at as long-term owners, we look at the long view. So, you could go up, you introduce a proxy access proposal, the company goes up, maybe 53 basis points. We look at other valuations, 0.5% in one of the studies. And then there are others who say, hey, wait a minute, this may be causing some harm. I think it's fair to say that over the long term, I think this will adjust. And perhaps we're looking at this the wrong way. I mean, maybe we should just finally say boards need to be held accountable to a high standard. Let's assume for a minute, James, that we rarely use the right to run a director, because I don't want to mislead people. Having 3% ownership of a company over 3 years, I mean, that's a lot of stake in a company. As large as our pension fund is, The most we have in any one company is a 0.5 percentage point. So the New York City retirement system, if we have real concerns, we can't run a director by ourselves. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I don't want this to be something that triggers an industry backlash. We want it out there so that the CEO or the chairman of the board understands that those of us who have invested in this company, we have a tool, rarely used, that holds them accountable. And that's why I think when we've been successful at some of these companies, and you've seen the valuation go up a little bit, it's because we've introduced a tool of accountability.
I just want to clarify there that what we actually found was the valuation went down a little bit when the vote was successful, not the inverse is what we found. But again, this is tentative, and I don't want to suggest that this is the final word. I really just sort of wanted to tease out. And what you're suggesting is that maybe the long term is different than the short term. I mean, to that effect, we did a long-term study that we released today, a companion study by Professor Tracy White at the University of Tennessee. It did not include New York City fund data because you're not a 13F filer, but it included a lot of the other large pension funds, including the New York State Fund, Florida, the two big California funds, and others. And what Tracy found was that public pension fund ownership, contrary to the sort of long-term view in general, is associated with lower share value, controlling for lots of different factors, and that's particularly driven by social or policy proposal activism, where the fund's taking a social or social policy orientation to the company. Again, proxy access on its face is certainly not that. It's what we would call a corporate governance rule, which didn't have a statistical relationship to share value up or down, but certainly some of your screening criteria are what we would call social or policy-oriented criteria. In light of that broad finding, you're structured differently than, say, the New York State Common Retirement Fund, which we showed a significant negative relationship with share value. Other states run their funds differently. You've been in this a while. You've got boards, independent boards on 5 different funds. Are there takeaways in terms of what sorts of duties and fiduciary responsibilities ought to be placed on these funds that are for the public good?
So let's just break up the question a little bit. So you introduced a study that's coming out today that
just released today.
That didn't include the New York City Retirement Fund.
That's correct. So it doesn't reflect
if
good
you
or bad.
If you had included our public pension fund, 4th largest in America, 12th largest in the world, you would have seen our valuation up 2.5%, which probably would have skewed in a different direction in the study. So I think you and I should agree that Tracy should come back next year, incorporate a successful pension fund, and then look at the numbers that way. So the point is that, everybody has numbers that they want to fit into a box. I think the beauty of proxy access, if you can ever think proxy access is beautiful like I do, is that, somebody laughed, is that the numbers will fit depending on who's doing the study, as Tracy shows by excluding our pension fund. But the reality is that let's go back to what this is about. It's about boardroom accountability. It's about boardroom diversity. It's about making sure we don't have a runaway CEO. It's making sure that companies, like energy companies, that ignore the specter of climate change and clean energy and just have their head in the sand for long-term investors. That's what this is about. This is about accountability and giving share owners the right they've always had, but they haven't had the mechanism to get it done, which is the ability to run a director or directors. There never should be a ballot in a democracy, right, where one slate put forth by a handful of insiders dominate corporate America. There has to be checks and balances. And when we have checks and balances, James, we actually do well in this country, and corporate America does well. We're not here to upend our corporations. That would be a fool's errand. I actually root for every corporation we invest in, 3,500 companies, to do well every day. When Apple introduces a new iPhone, that means my cop or firefighter is going to have a more secure pension. When Google does well, we have better retirement security for our folks. So this is about making sure that we're helping build long-term value for all of our companies.
All right. On that note, I just want to clarify that the reason you were excluded was simply because it's not publicly reported in 13F. I also want to emphasize that based on the econometric methodology there, it's not going to affect the findings we have, and it could affect the social proposal findings or the corporate governance findings, but it's not going to affect, for instance, our finding that the New York State Common Retirement Fund has a negative association with share value, because those are independently controlled for in separate studies.
Can I just
Sure.
kind of, part of my job as control, in addition to the pension fund work, is the auditor-in-chief of the city. So we do audits of city agencies, we do audits of mayoral agencies. That's why sometimes Mayor de Blasio and I don't always get along. But we have a standard, right, in our audits. And we have procedures and a process to get accurate results. And that's why sometimes when a study is done that can't or doesn't include a factor, it's just skewed. So it's hard to evaluate it. And I would just respectfully say, you got to come back to this in a different way.
Well, we really appreciate your willingness to share your ownership data, and we're confident that somebody out there, whether it's Manhattan Institute or otherwise, will take you up on that and do that analysis. And certainly if it shows something different, I mean, realizing that most of this data we're talking about is going to be data that predates your tenure, because what we're talking about is the New York City Common Retirement Fund from 2001 to 2013. That's the study we were doing today. So it wouldn't have captured the proxy access campaign in any event. But we really welcome your openness. So I appreciate that.
Anything we can do, anything we can do
for us as researchers.
Anything we can do legally to get you to a better result, I will.
Thank you very much. So I do want to open us up to audience questions at this point, because I'm sure a lot of them may have some questions as well. Up here in the front. Please identify yourself for the camera. Thanks.
Roger Hur's time and acronym to improve municipal efficiency. Has there been an effort to do the same calculation of a day before and 5 days after for a longer period of time?
The answer to this is no. In terms of what I've done, the answer is not for a longer period of time, and that's because proxy access, all I was looking at was 2015, and so we didn't really have a long form period. Well, I did do a year analysis on the public pension funds broadly and showed that shareholder proposal activism was negatively related overall with share value. The New York City funds actually there were slightly positive, but the overall, driven in no small part by the New York State Common Retirement Fund, was negative overall. I discussed sort of the peculiarities of that in some detail in some writings, which I can certainly send your way. But I certainly will want to look going forward at longer term effects, not just the initial stock price reaction. I think there's actually a fundamental problem to some degree with just a simple sort of day stock price study. So I agree with the comptroller on that. I mean, I just want to emphasize, though, that those event studies, the one-day reaction studies, are precisely what the CFA Institute's looking at, and those are precisely the empirical evidence upon which the intellectual foundation for proxy access adding value is built upon. So in criticizing those one-day event studies, you're sort of to somewhat undercutting the empirical foundation, the intellectual foundation that the campaign itself is premised on. But I do agree with you that longer-term effects, and I agree with the comptroller, longer-term effects should absolutely be judged. And it's not always going to be just empirical. I mean, we're going to have to look and see at how this is done in practice, right? I mean, how are companies threatened? I mean, are the public pension funds going to be out there and pressuring a bunch of companies and saying, you know, if you don't put X, Y people on your boards, or if you don't put clean energy programs out there, you know, we're going to come after you. You sort of got to tease some of that out. So it's going to be a tricky analysis to do, but it's precisely the sort of analysis I like to do. And the one virtue that I'll say, I mean, that I've been consistent about since the comptroller launched the Boardroom Accountability Project is they have been very transparent. So again, I appreciate his willingness to come forward and say they're going to put data out there. I also just appreciate the fact that they've been very transparent about how they're selecting companies. I would tend to go towards a much more performance-based approach if I were talking about any corporate governance rule, because I think that's what empirical evidence actually shows robustly, not what I call a blunderbuss approach that sort of targets a large swath of companies. But I really appreciate the transparency that they've displayed here.
So To your question, let me first say to James, which I really haven't, I think the work that you do and the way your analysis is really about value, and in your heart, I think you're really focused on that, and that's why I'm surprised when you shift a little bit and say, well, let's now look at the practical impact of proxy access. Are they going to go after companies? That's not what we do in the fiduciary business. So what we do is make sure that the companies are creating value. So one body of work that I want to introduce you to, because it doesn't always have to come from me, but the Securities and Exchange Commission study actually analyzed the Boardroom Accountability Project. They actually took the time to do an analysis of the 75 companies that we targeted, our targeted firms, and found that they identified a 0.5% increase in share owner value for those 75 firms. So that signals that this is not about going after a company, because when you say going after, that means you want to bring you're rabble-rousing the company. What we want to do is value the company. And I just want to make that distinction, because I think you were headed towards that through most of the discussion today.
Yeah, well,
we may disagree on
but go ahead.
number.
I mean, introducing a shareholder proposal that the management or the board is against is basically what I mean there. I don't mean to have a broad normative value to that. But again, what I want to point out is that the study done by SEC economists, who are some of the same economists that put forward the mandatory proxy access rule, I mean, what that was precisely was a one-day event study that found controlling for 4 different factors, beta, the so-called FAMA fringe factors, beta of the company, which is the relationship to the market price, book value to market value, the size of the company, a momentum factor, and industry, that there was a 0.5 percentage points explanatory factor with a dummy variable on that one day coming out there for the introduction of that. I want to say is, yes, I think that's a legitimate study, but there are other ones too, which is why I wanted to look at what the stock price is doing based on the actual shareholder votes. So you don't really have it both ways, where you're saying, well, we're going to support this one-day short-term study, but we're going to reject these because we want long-term studies. I think it's important to take the totality of the evidence and look at this, and my position's never been and won't be that proxy access is always wrong for any company or anything like that. I think it's a case-by-case basis on the company for what the appropriate corporate governance rules are for that company, as opposed to, my concern is here, a one-size-fits-all rule that's put broadly out there, sometimes for reasons that aren't clearly related to share value.
So basically what Roger is saying, which you and I basically agree with, is, you come with some data. I've come here today, CFA data, SEC data. At the end of the day, it is about where we're going to be some time from now.
That's right.
Right? I think we would both, that's I think where we find common ground at the end
Absolutely.
of the day.
And I appreciate that we're both concerned with share value. We're absolutely both concerned with share value. We go about it a different way, and one of us might be right and one of us might be wrong, but we're both concerned with that. So, up here.
So I think that the comptroller mentioned that the proxy access campaign is a topic that you're very committed to, and that you believe there's more work to continue to be done. Last year, right, based on your targeting, you filed a proposal with 75 companies. 2 questions for you. One is, what does the project look like this fall, this spring, in terms of your continuing your campaigns and efforts? And 2, when and how do you expect to start using proxy access once you have these new rights?
Well, good question. Start with the last one first. We've been able to build agreements with some very significant companies. They've agreed to this. Obviously, implementation is something we're going to work on, we're going to work towards. We also want to go in and look at companies that are not moving in the direction of implementing proxy access, given the fact that in some cases there's been votes of 70, 75%. We're also going to work with the Securities and Exchange Commission, because I do think there should be a universal proxy access rule, which would take away from going company by company and winning these votes. I met with Mary Jo White a year ago, and she and the SEC the SEC, I think, was very, like James, was very interested, intrigued by proxy access, and they basically said, go out there and go to corporate America, go talk to these companies, and we'll have some data, we'll look at some of this and analyze it. So I think next year we're going to continue to offer resolutions. We'll probably expand the number of companies. We do not do this on our own. This is a unusual coalition of public pension funds and business leaders from across the country, from CalPERS and CalSTRS, Texas teachers. This is a huge, huge effort and also through the lens of some real professionals out there. So we have a lot more to do. Again, this is also making it clear that this is about something that you and I agree with. This is about, long-term value. How we get to long-term value, to me and to many experts in the field, is about corporate boards that are diverse, corporate boards that don't fall into groupthink mentality. We've got to look at our pool of directors and create mentorship programs for the best and the brightest that will come to these companies. We want every young person to have an opportunity to succeed in corporate America. That's not just good for those kids, right? It's good for business. I think that's something we can all agree on. Diversity in the workplace, diversity on boards, we just get better results, we get better protection, and that is what the goal of this will be. So we're going to be in this space as long as I'm controller.
Our time has come to an end there. That's I think, the last word I will give to the comptroller. I really appreciate you joining us here in a spirited discussion. I hope this has been engaging for all of you. I would ask each of you to fill out a evaluation form if you want CLE credit and to sign out. We don't have that approval yet, but I'm confident we will get it. And I appreciate all of your attendance. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you.
A lot of fun. Thank you. A lot of fun.